The sound of crying came through the wall again, and Duke Alistair Whitmore stopped walking for only a moment before he made himself keep going. It was the third night in a row. He had heard it the first night, and told himself it was nothing, a bride settling into a strange house, missing her old life. He had heard it the second night, and told himself the same thing, only a little less certain. Now, on the third night, standing in the dark corridor outside her door, with his hand not quite touching the wood, he was no longer sure what he believed. He only knew that he did not go in. He turned instead, and walked back to his own chambers, and he told himself, as he had told himself every night since the wedding, that it was not his place to ask. They had been married 11 days. Seraphina Ashworth had become Seraphina Whitmore, Duchess of Ashcombe, in a ceremony that lasted less than an hour, and left both families relieved and neither family happy. Her father owed a debt so large it would have taken 3 generations to repay, and Alistair's family held the paper on that debt. A marriage settled it. That was the whole of it, as far as anyone outside the two families knew, and as far as Alistair himself had been told when his mother sat him down and explained, in the calm voice she used for unpleasant business, that he would marry Lord Ashworth's daughter within the month. He had not argued. There had seemed no point. He was 31 years old and had long ago accepted that a man in his position did not marry for feeling, only for necessity, and if necessity had a face, it might as well be a kind one. When he had first seen Seraphina, standing very straight in her father's drawing room, with her hands folded in front of her, he had thought her face was, in fact, kind. He had also thought it was the saddest face he had ever seen on someone who was supposed to be happy. She had not smiled at their first meeting. She had not smiled at the church. She had not smiled at the wedding breakfast, where guests raised their glasses and wished the couple joy, and she had thanked them in a voice so quiet that several people leaned forward without meaning to. Alistair had noticed all of this and set it aside, the way he set aside most things that were inconvenient to think about. A woman forced into marriage might reasonably be expected to look unhappy. It did not require an explanation. It required only patience, and perhaps, eventually, some small kindness on his part, though he had not yet found the time or the inclination to offer it. Now, lying awake in his own bed with the crying finally stopped on the other side of the wall, he found himself thinking about her more than he wanted to. In the morning, she was, as always, perfectly composed. She sat across from him at the long breakfast table, her hands folded the same way they had been folded in her father's drawing room, and she answered his few questions about the day's plans with brief, polite replies. Her eyes were not red. Whatever she had done to hide the marks of the night before, she had done well. Alistair watched her spread a thin layer of butter on a piece of toast she would not eat, and he thought, not for the first time, that she moved through her own life like a guest who was waiting to be told she could leave. "You slept well?" he asked, because it seemed the sort of thing a husband ought to ask, even one who had not gone to her. "Yes, thank you," she said, and did not look up. He did not press her. He told himself there was nothing to press. A new bride in a strange house, missing her family, her old rooms, her old life. It was ordinary sadness, the kind that would fade with time, the kind that was not, strictly speaking, any of his business to solve. He had an estate to run. There were tenants with complaints about the drainage on the east fields, a letter from his solicitor about a boundary dispute with the neighboring property, and a meeting in the afternoon with his steward that he could not put off. He finished his tea, folded his napkin, and left the table with a small bow that was more habit than warmth, and Seraphina remained behind, alone, with her cold, buttered toast. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, who had run Ashcombe Manor since before Alistair was born, and who noticed everything that happened within its walls whether she wished to or not, watched the new Duchess sit alone at the table for a long while after the Duke had gone. She watched her pick up the toast and set it down again without eating it. She watched her look, for just a moment, toward the window, where the gray morning light fell across the lawn, and she watched the young woman's shoulders rise and fall in something that was not quite a sigh, and not quite a sob, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. Mrs. Fenwick did not say anything. It was not her place, and she had learned long ago that the business of the family upstairs was not the business of the staff downstairs, however much the staff might see and hear. But that evening, in the kitchen, over the washing up, she mentioned to the young under-housemaid, Winifred, that she thought the new Duchess seemed a very sad sort of bride, sadder than most, and Winifred, who slept in a room not far from Seraphina's own chambers, said quietly that she had heard crying nearly every night since the wedding, and that once, passing the door with an armful of linens, she thought she had heard the Duchess say a name, though she could not be sure whose name it was, only that it was said the way one says the name of someone who is gone. Mrs. Fenwick told her to hush and mind her work, but she did not forget what the girl had said. Days passed in this manner. Alistair rose early, attended to his estate, ate his meals across from a wife who answered politely and volunteered nothing, and retired each night to his own rooms, where, more often than not, he heard the same quiet, careful crying through the wall, crying that stopped the moment he came near the door, as though she knew, even through the stone and plaster, that he was standing there. He began, without quite admitting it to himself, to listen for it. He told himself he was only concerned for the smooth running of his household, that a duchess who could not sleep would be no good use to anyone, that it reflected poorly on him as a husband if word got round that his bride wept every night in a house full of servants who talked among themselves whether they meant to or not. These were the reasons he gave himself. They were not, if he was honest, the real reason he found himself pausing in the corridor each night a little longer than the night before. It was on the 12th night, nearly a fortnight since the wedding, that something changed, though only slightly, and only for a moment. He had come up later than usual, having sat too long over his correspondence, and the house was dark and quiet, in the way old houses become quiet after midnight, full of small sounds that meant nothing. A settling beam, a draught finding its way under a door, the distant call of an owl, somewhere out past the stable yard. He passed her door as he always did, and he heard, as he always did, the low, careful sound of someone crying, as though they did not want to be heard. But this time, instead of walking on, he stopped. He stood there in the dark corridor, with his hand raised, not quite touching the door, and he thought about knocking. He thought about what he would say if he did. He had no practice at this sort of thing. He did not know how to comfort a woman he barely knew, who had been given to him the way property is given, who wept every night for reasons she had never once mentioned to him, and that he had never once asked about. He thought, standing there, that perhaps this was the trouble, that in 11 days, and now 12, he had asked her nothing real at all. He had asked whether she slept well. He had asked whether the day's plans suited her. He had never once asked why she looked, from the very first moment he saw her, like a woman standing at a grave. He lowered his hand without knocking. He told himself it was too late in the night, that whatever trouble she carried was not the sort of thing to raise for the first time at midnight through a closed door, that he would speak with her properly, in daylight, when there was time to do it right. He told himself this, and he went to his own room, and he lay awake a long while listening to the silence that had fallen on the other side of the wall the moment he had stopped outside her door, and he thought, with a discomfort he was not used to feeling, that she had known he was there. She always knew, and she always waited, in silence, until he was gone, before she let herself cry again. He did not speak with her the next day, nor the day after that. There was always some reason. A visit from a neighboring landowner, a matter with the tenants, a letter that needed answering before the post went out. He told himself each time that he would find a better moment, and each time the better moment did not come, and each night the crying returned, quiet and careful and hidden, as though she had built a wall around her sorrow, just as thick as the one that stood between their two rooms. It was Mrs. Fenwick in the end who first said something that reached him, though she did not mean it to be overheard. He had come down to the kitchen passage late one evening, to ask after a matter of household accounts, and he heard her voice before he saw her, speaking to Winifred in the low, private tone servants use when they believe themselves unheard by anyone who matters. "Poor lamb," Mrs. Fenwick was saying. "Married a fortnight and grieving like it was yesterday. Whatever happened in that family, it's not left her yet, and I don't think it will." "Grieving for what, do you think?" Winifred asked. "I couldn't say," said Mrs. Fenwick, "but I've seen grief before, and I know the shape of it. That's not homesickness, whatever His Grace might think it is, that's mourning." Alistair did not make his presence known. He stood very still in the shadow of the passage, and he felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for. Not quite guilt, not quite alarm, but something close to both. Mourning. The word settled into him, and would not leave. He had told himself, all this time, that her sadness was the ordinary sadness of a bride taken from her home. He had not once considered that it might be something else entirely, that she might be carrying a loss so heavy it had followed her, uninvited, into her own wedding. He turned and walked back the way he had come, without asking about the household accounts at all. And that night, for the first time since the wedding, he found himself standing outside her door, not simply listening, but wondering, in earnest, what he did not know about the woman he had married. He did not knock. Not that night, but something in him had changed, quietly, the way weather changes before anyone notices the sky. He began to watch her more closely at meals, to notice the way her eyes moved to the window when she thought no one was looking, the way her hand sometimes stilled over her plate, as though she had forgotten, for a moment, where she was. He noticed that she wore, always, a small ring on a chain beneath her collar, one that was not part of any jewelry he had given her, and he wondered, with a curiosity that surprised him in its intensity, who had given it to her, and why she kept it hidden rather than worn plainly on her hand. He did not ask her that either, not yet. He was a man used to solving problems with patience and distance, not with questions that might open a wound he did not know how to close. But the seed had been planted, and it would not stop growing. Somewhere in that house, behind a locked door of grief she had not shared with him, there was a reason his bride had not smiled once since the day she became his wife, and Alistair Whitmore, who had married her out of necessity, and treated her ever since with the careful indifference of a man discharging a duty, found himself wanting, for the first time, to know what it was. The house grew quieter as autumn deepened, the gardens turning brown and the wind picking up along the long drive, and through all of it Serafina moved like a shadow of herself, dutiful, composed, and entirely alone. Alistair watched her now with new eyes, though he said nothing, and the crying continued each night, and each night he stood a little longer outside her door, before he made himself walk away, telling himself, with less and less conviction, that it was not yet the right time to ask. But the right time was coming, whether he was ready for it or not, and neither of them yet knew how close it was. The rain came early that year, settling over Ashcombe Manor in long gray sheets that kept everyone indoors for days at a stretch, and it was during one of those closed-in afternoons that Alistair first noticed the painting. He had never paid it much attention before. It hung in the small sitting room at the end of the east corridor, a room Serafina had claimed for her own use shortly after the wedding, though she rarely invited anyone into it, and Alistair had never once thought to ask why. The painting showed two young girls, perhaps 10 and 12 years old, standing in a garden he did not recognize, their arms linked, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. He recognized one of the girls at once. It was Serafina, younger, brighter, her whole face open in a way he had never seen since the day he met her. He did not recognize the other girl. He stood in the doorway a long moment, studying the painting, and when he turned, he found Serafina watching him from the chair by the window, her needlework forgotten in her lap. "Who is this with you?" he asked, before he could stop himself, before he could think of a gentler way to ask it. Something crossed her face, quick and sharp, like a door closing. "My sister," she said. Her voice was flat, careful, the voice of someone choosing each word with great effort. "Rosalind. I did not know you had a sister." "No," she said. "I don't suppose you would." There was nothing accusing in the way she said it, only a kind of tired resignation, as though she had long ago stopped expecting anyone to ask her the right questions. Alistair felt the weight of it land somewhere in his chest, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. He had known, in the vaguest terms, that her family had once been larger, that there had been some trouble in recent years that reduced the household to just her and her father, but he had never pressed for details, and no one had offered them. It had not seemed important. Now, looking at the painting, at the easy joy on both girls' faces, he wondered how much he had missed simply by never asking. "Where is she now?" he asked. "Your sister. Does she visit?" Serafina's hands tightened around the needlework in her lap. "She does not visit," she said, and there was something final in the way she said it. A door not just closing but locking, and Alistair, sensing he had reached the edge of what she would allow, said nothing more. He left the room with more questions than he had entered it with, and the painting stayed in his mind the rest of the day. The two girls linked arm in arm, laughing at something he would never see. That evening, Over a dinner eaten mostly in silence, he tried once more, gently, to open the subject he had closed too quickly that morning. "Your sister," he said, setting down his fork. "Rosalind. Is she younger than you, or older?" Serafina's eyes lifted to his, and for a moment, he thought she might answer properly, might let him pass the wall she had built so carefully around herself. But then something in her expression shuddered again, and she said only, "Younger," before turning her attention back to her plate, and the conversation, such as it was, ended there. He did not push further, though it cost him something not to. He had begun, without quite meaning to care what the answer might be, and the not knowing had started to sit uneasily in him, like a stone in a shoe he could not remove. The staff, meanwhile, had their own theories, murmured in the kitchen, and the laundry, and the long servants' corridor, where gossip traveled faster than any letter could. Winifred, who had been in service at Ashcombe only 2 years, but had a sharp memory for the things people let slip, mentioned one evening that she had heard, from a maid at her cousin's house who had once worked for Lord Ashworth's family, that there had been a second daughter, and that something terrible had happened to her not long before the wedding was arranged, though the maid herself had not known what. "Terrible how?" Winifred had asked her cousin. "I don't rightly know," her cousin had said. "Only that the house went into mourning, sudden like, black crape on the windows and all. And not 2 months after, the wedding to the Duke was announced, quiet and quick, like they wanted it done before anyone could ask too many questions." Winifred repeated this to Mrs. Fenwick, who told her firmly to keep such talk to herself, that it was not their place to speculate on the sorrows of the family upstairs, but privately, Mrs. Fenwick found herself troubled by it, and she began to watch the young Duchess with a closer, kinder eye, noticing the way she flinched whenever mourning was mentioned in passing, the way she avoided the small chapel on the estate grounds as though it held something she could not bear to see. Alistair, for his part, began to notice these things too, now that he was looking. He noticed that Serafina wore black beneath her grey travelling coat on the one occasion they rode into the village together, a colour no one had commented on, because it was so easily hidden beneath the practical fabric of her outer clothes. He noticed that she never spoke of her father without a certain careful distance, as though she were describing a stranger rather than her own parent. He noticed, most of all, that she had not once, in nearly 3 weeks of marriage, mentioned any plans to have her family visit, nor expressed any wish to visit them herself, as though the house she had come from held nothing she wished to return to, or perhaps, he thought with a growing unease, nothing left to return to at all. He found himself, late one night, standing again outside her door, listening to the same quiet crying he had grown almost used to, and this time the thought came to him clearly, unbidden, and would not leave. What if it was not homesickness at all, not grief for a life she missed, but grief for someone she had lost, someone whose absence she carried with her everywhere, hidden beneath black fabric and careful silence, the way she hid the small ring on the chain beneath her collar. He raised his hand to knock, and again he lowered it, and again he told himself it was not the right moment, though the excuse felt thinner now than it had a fortnight before. The rain continued through the week, and with it came a letter, delivered to Serafina by the morning post, and read by her alone, in the small sitting room, where the painting of the 2 sisters hung. Alistair did not see the letter arrive, but he saw its effects. She did not come down for the midday meal. When Mrs. Fenwick knocked at her door to ask whether she required anything, she received no answer at first, and when at last the door opened, the housekeeper found the young Duchess pale and trembling, a folded letter clutched so tightly in her hand that her knuckles had gone white. "Shall I fetch his grace?" Mrs. Fenwick asked gently. "No," Serafina said, too quickly. "No, there is no need. Please, say nothing to him." Mrs. Fenwick, torn between her duty to the household and a growing tenderness toward the young woman she had come to pity, agreed, though it sat poorly with her conscience. She helped Serafina back to her bed, brought her a cup of tea she did not drink, and left her to rest, closing the door softly behind her. Alistair learned only that his wife was unwell, and had kept to her room for the remainder of the day. He was told nothing of the letter, and he did not think to ask whether one had come, though later he would remember this day as the point at which the silence between them had grown from something merely uncomfortable into something that felt, unmistakably, like danger. The silence not of 2 strangers learning to live together, but of one person drowning quietly, while the other stood just out of reach, unaware of how close the water had risen. That night, for the first time, the crying did not stop when he approached her door. It went on, low and broken, longer than he had ever heard it, and Alistair stood in the dark corridor with his hand pressed flat against the wood, and for the first time, he did not lower it. He knocked, softly, once. The crying stopped instantly, the way it always did, but this time no silence followed. Instead, after a long pause, he heard her voice, thin and unsteady, through the door. "Please," she said. "Not tonight. I cannot, not tonight." He stood there a moment longer, his hand still against the wood, and then, gently, he said the only thing he could think to say. "I am not here to trouble you," he told her. "I only wanted you to know that I heard you, and that I am here, if ever you wish to speak." There was no answer. But when he finally turned and walked back to his own room, he thought, though he could not be certain, that the crying on the other side of the wall had grown quieter, not because it stopped, but because she was, perhaps for the first time since the wedding, not entirely certain she was alone in it. He did not sleep well that night. He lay awake turning over everything he had learned and everything he had not, the sister in the painting who did not visit, the black fabric hidden beneath gray coats, the ring worn always out of sight, the letter that had left his wife trembling and pale, the mourning that had apparently swept through her father's house not long before the wedding was arranged. Piece by piece, though he did not yet have the whole of it, a shape was beginning to form in his mind, a shape he did not like, and the following morning, for the first time since their wedding day, Alistair Whitmore resolved that he would not let another week pass without learning the truth his wife had been carrying alone. The following morning, Alistair rose earlier than usual and asked Mrs. Fenwick to bring word to the stables that he would be riding out to Ashworth Hall before midday. It was not a visit he had planned, nor one he had any real reason to make, but he told himself that a call upon his wife's father was a reasonable enough thing for a new husband to do, and that whatever he learned there, he would learn honestly, without needing to press Seraphina for answers she was clearly not ready to give. Ashworth Hall sat 2 hours' ride from Ashcombe, a smaller house than his own, handsome once but showing now the quiet signs of a family that had fallen on difficult times, ivy grown wild along one wing, a fountain in the front court that had not run in years, curtains drawn in windows that should have been open to the morning light. Lord Ashworth received him in a study that smelled of old paper and cold ash, and though he greeted his son-in-law with every appearance of warmth, Alistair noticed the way the older man's eyes moved, briefly and involuntarily, toward a closed door at the far end of the room, before he waved his guest to a chair. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" Lord Ashworth asked, settling behind his desk with the careful ease of a man determined to appear untroubled. "I wish to see how you fared," Alistair said, "and to ask after your household. Seraphina has not spoken much of home since the wedding." Something flickered across Lord Ashworth's face, there and gone so quickly that Alistair might have imagined it, had he not been watching for exactly such a thing. "She has settled well, I trust," the older man said, rather than answered. "Ashcombe suits her, I hope." "She is quiet," Alistair said carefully. "Quieter, I think, than she was before the wedding. I wondered whether something in this house might explain it." Lord Ashworth's hands, resting on the desk before him, went very still. "Grief takes its own time," he said at last, and his voice had lost some of its careful warmth. "She has always been the stronger of my 2 daughters. I trust her to bear what she must." The words landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water, and Alistair felt the ripples of them long after Lord Ashworth had changed the subject to matters of the estate and the coming harvest. 2 daughters. The man had said it plainly, without seeming to notice he had said anything remarkable at all, as though the fact were so heavy and so old in his own mind that he had forgotten it might be new to someone else. Alistair did not press him further in that moment. He had learned, in his years of managing difficult tenants and prouder neighbors, that a man cornered too quickly would give nothing away but his temper. He steered the conversation instead toward safer ground, the harvest, the roads, a shared complaint about the price of grain, and all the while he watched the closed door at the far end of the study, and he wondered what lay behind it, and why Lord Ashworth's eyes kept returning to it, as though it held something he could not stop himself from checking was still there. When at last he rose to take his leave, he asked, as casually as he could manage, "And your younger daughter?" "Rosalind, I believe her name was." Does she reside here still? The change in Lord Ashworth was immediate and unmistakable. The color left his face, and for a moment he looked, to Alistair's eye, like a man who had been struck. He recovered himself quickly, forcing a thin smile that did not reach his eyes, and said only, "Rosalind is no longer with us," before rising abruptly and offering his hand in farewell, making it clear, without another word, that the visit had come to its end. Alistair rode home slower than he had ridden out, turning the words over and over. No longer with us. It was the sort of phrase people used when a thing was too painful to say plainly, and he had heard it used before, at funerals, in letters of condolence, in the careful language people reached for when death sat too close for ordinary words. He thought of the painting of the two laughing girls in the sitting room at Ashcombe. He thought of the black fabric hidden beneath gray coats, the ring worn out of sight, the letter that had left his wife trembling. Piece by piece, the shape in his mind grew clearer, though he still lacked the center of it, the reason, the how, and the when, and above all, the reason no one, not Seraphina, not her father, not a single member of either household, had ever once spoken it plainly to him. He arrived home as the light was beginning to fail, and he found Seraphina in the small sitting room, as she so often was, seated near the window with her needlework untouched in her lap, watching the last gray light fade over the gardens. She looked up when he entered, and something in her face changed at the sight of him, a wariness he had not seen before, and he understood at once that she knew where he had been. "You went to my father's house," she said. It was not a question. "I did," he admitted. There seemed no purpose in denying it. "I wished to understand you better, and I did not know how else to begin." "And did you?" she asked, her voice very quiet, very careful. "Understand me better?" He crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite hers, close enough now that he could see the fine tremor in her hands, where they rested against the fabric of her needlework. "I learned that you had a sister," he said gently, "and that she is gone. I do not yet know how, or when, or why no one has spoken her name to me until now. I do not ask you to tell me tonight, if it is too soon. But I would like, very much, to understand, when you are ready." For a long moment she said nothing at all. He watched her throat move, as she swallowed, watched her eyes fill, and then, with visible effort, clear again, the way a person forces themselves not to break in front of another, when they have spent a long time learning how to hide it. "It is not a simple story," she said at last. "I did not imagine it would be," he said. She looked at him then, really looked at him, in a way she had not done since the wedding, as though she were seeing him for the first time, not as the stranger she had been given to, but as a man who had, for whatever reason, chosen this evening to stop looking away. "Why now?" she asked. "You have been content, these 3 weeks, not to ask." It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer, though the honesty of it cost him something to admit. "Because I heard you weeping every night," he said, "and I told myself, each time, that it was not my place to ask. I was wrong to tell myself that. I understand it now. Whatever grief you carry, you should not have had to carry it alone in a house that is meant, now, to be your home." Her eyes filled again, and this time she did not force them clear. A single tear slipped free, and she did not wipe it away, and for the first time since their wedding day, she did not look away from him either. "Her name was Rosalind," she said softly, "and she was meant to be your bride, not I." The words fell between them in the quiet room, and Alistair felt the shape in his mind, the one he had been building piece by piece all day, finally begin to take its true form, though he understood, even as she said it, that this was only the beginning of the story, not the whole of it, and that whatever came next would change the way he understood his marriage, and his wife, and the 11 days of silence that had passed between them, before he had finally thought to ask. "Tell me," he said gently, "whatever you are ready to tell me, I am listening, and I will not look away again." Seraphina drew a slow, unsteady breath, the breath of someone standing at the edge of a story she had told no one, not even herself, in its entirety. And after a long moment, she began. "Rosalind was 2 years younger than I," Seraphina said, her voice low and steady now, the way a person speaks when they have decided, finally, to stop holding a thing back. "She was the brighter of the two of us, always. Where I was careful, she was bold. Where I worried over every small decision, She simply acted, and laughed, and trusted that things would come right in the end. Our mother died when we were young, and it was Rosalind, not I, who kept our father's spirits up in the years after, who made him laugh at the dinner table when he had spent the day buried in accounts he could not make balance. I do not think he ever loved either of us more than the other, but I think, if I am honest, that she was easier to love. She asked for less and gave more, without ever seeming to notice she was doing it. Alistair said nothing, only listened, and she seemed grateful for his silence, as though it gave her room to keep going without needing to defend each word. It was Rosalind. The arrangement was made for, she went on. Our father's debts had grown beyond anything he could manage alone, and your family held the greatest part of them. When the match was first proposed, it was proposed for her. She was the younger daughter, and it is often the way such things are arranged, that the younger goes first, if she is thought the more agreeable match. She did not resent it. I remember she laughed about it, actually, the night our father told us. She said she supposed she would have to learn to like being called Your Grace, and she made me practice curtsies with her in her room, until we were both dizzy with laughing. Her voice caught, and she paused, pressing her fingers briefly to her lips before continuing. She fell ill that winter. It began as nothing, a cough, a fever that would not break, the kind of illness that moves through a house in the cold months and usually passes. But it did not pass. It settled into her chest, and no physician we brought to her could shift it, and within 6 weeks of the day our father told us of the arrangement, she was gone. The room had grown very quiet. Outside, the last light had faded entirely from the windows, and neither of them had risen to call for candles, so that they sat now in a soft, deepening dark that seemed, somehow, to make the telling easier. I do not know how to describe what those weeks were like, Serafina said. I sat with her nearly every night. I held her hand, until it was too weak to hold mine back. I promised her things I could not keep, that she would be well by spring, that we would laugh again at her being a duchess, that everything our father feared would come right in the end, the way it always had before. And then one morning, she simply did not wake, and I have never in my life felt anything so much like the floor disappearing beneath me. I am so sorry, Alistair said quietly, and meant it more than he had meant almost anything he had said in years. There is more, Serafina said, and her voice grew harder now, not with anger at him, he understood, but with the effort of forcing herself through the part of the story that clearly cost her the most. My father's debts did not die with her. The arrangement your family had made was for a daughter of his house, not for Rosalind alone, and within a fortnight of burying her, he came to me and asked whether I would take her place. Alistair felt something cold settle in his chest. He asked you this, a fortnight after she died. He did not ask cruelly, Serafina said, quick to defend him even now. I do not think he meant it cruelly. He was a man drowning, and I was the only rope left within his reach. He told me that if I refused, the debt would fall due in full, and we would lose everything, the house, the land, the last of what our mother had left us. He did not tell me I must smile through it. He did not tell me I must pretend to be happy. He asked only that I go through with the marriage quietly, without explaining to your family the full truth of what had happened, because he feared, I think, that if your family learned the bride they were receiving was not the one they had first been promised, and a grieving one besides, they might reconsider the whole arrangement and ruin us entirely. So you said nothing, Alistair said slowly, understanding now, at last, the shape of the silence he had lived inside for 3 weeks. You buried your sister, and within a month, you stood at the altar in her place, grieving her every hour, and you were asked to carry all of it, without ever once letting it show. Yes, Serafina said simply. That is exactly what I did. He sat very still, absorbing the full weight of it. The wedding, cold and quick, that he had assumed was only the awkwardness of 2 strangers, thrown together by necessity. The sadness he had told himself was homesickness, ordinary and expected. The tears each night that he had heard through the wall and told himself, again and again, were not his concern to ask about. All of it had been, from the very first day, the private mourning of a woman who had lost her sister, and then been asked, immediately after, to become that sister's replacement in every outward sense, to wear her place at the altar, to answer to her name in the minds of a family who did not yet know the truth, to smile, if she could manage it, at a wedding breakfast held so soon after a funeral that the black crepe had likely still hung in the windows of her father's house. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked, though even as he said it, he understood the answer before she gave it. "Because you never asked," she said, not unkindly, but plainly, the way one states a fact long accepted. "In 3 weeks, you asked me whether I slept well. You asked me whether the day's plans suited me. You never once asked why I looked as I did on our wedding day, and I confess, after the first week, I stopped expecting that you would. I told myself it was easier that way. If you never asked, I never had to decide whether telling you would help me or only burden you further, and I did not have the strength, in those first weeks, to carry anyone else's reaction to my grief along with my own." The honesty of it struck him harder than any accusation could have. He had told himself, all this time, that his distance was a kindness, that he was giving her space to settle in her own time. He understood now that it had not felt like kindness to her at all. It had felt like abandonment, quiet and polite and utterly without malice, but abandonment nonetheless, and she had borne the whole weight of her sister's death alone, in a house full of strangers, because the one person who might have shared the burden had never once thought to ask if there was a burden to share. "I am sorry," he said again, and this time, the words felt too small for what he meant by them. "I told myself, every night I heard you weeping, that it was not my place to intrude. I understand now how wrong that was. Grief shared is not an intrusion, Serafina. It is the very least a husband owes his wife." She looked at him for a long moment in the near dark, and something in her expression shifted, not into happiness, not yet, but into something quieter and more fragile, the beginning, perhaps, of trust where there had been none before. "There is still more you do not know," she said softly. "About the room in the East Wing, and about what my father asked of me before the wedding took place. I have not told you the whole of it, and I am not certain I am ready to, even now." "Then tell me what you are ready to tell," Alistair said, "and when you are ready for the rest, I will still be here to listen." For the first time since their wedding day, Serafina did not look away from him, and though she did not smile, something in her face eased, just slightly, like the first thaw after a long winter, and Alistair understood that whatever remained of the story, whatever secret still waited behind the locked door in the East Wing, he would need to earn the right to hear it, one honest conversation at a time. In the days that followed, something in the house began, slowly, to change. It was nothing anyone below stairs could have named precisely, but Mrs. Fenwick noticed it first, the way she noticed most things at Ashcombe Manor. The Duke began taking his breakfast a little later, so that he and his wife sat together longer over their tea. He began asking after her plans for the day, not out of habit, but with something that looked, to the housekeeper's practiced eye, like genuine interest. And though the young Duchess still did not smile, not truly, not yet, there was a softness in her now that had not been there before, a loosening of the shoulders, as though some great weight she had carried alone had, at last, been shared, even if it had not been lifted entirely. Alistair, for his part, found that he could not stop thinking of the ring beneath her collar, nor of the closed door at Ashworth Hall that Lord Ashworth's eyes had kept returning to, nor of the words Serafina herself had spoken, that there was more he did not know, about the room in the East Wing, and about what her father had asked of her before the wedding. He did not press her for it. He had learned, in the telling of Rosalind's story, that pressing only closed doors more firmly, and that patience, however difficult, was the only true key he had been given. It was Serafina herself who raised the subject again, some days later, on an evening, when the two of them sat together in the small sitting room beneath the painting of the two laughing sisters, a habit that had begun, almost without either of them noticing, to replace the silent, separate evenings that had marked the first weeks of their marriage. "You have not asked about the ring," she said, without preamble, her fingers rising unconsciously to touch the chain at her collar. "I did not think it my place," Alistair said, "though I confess I have wondered." She drew the chain out from beneath the fabric, and in the candlelight he saw it properly for the first time. A small, plain gold band, old-fashioned in its setting, far simpler than anything he would have expected a duke's daughter to treasure so carefully. "It was our mother's," she said. "She gave it to Rosalind before she died, when we were girls, because Rosalind had always loved it, And because our mother said she wanted each of us to have something to remember her by, that was not simply passed down out of duty, but chosen because we loved it. She gave me a different piece, a brooch, which I still have, though I do not wear it often. This ring was Rosalind's alone. And now you wear it, Alistair said gently. I took it from her hand, Serafina said, the morning after she died, before anyone else came into the room. I do not know why I did it. I think I could not bear the thought of it being packed away with the rest of her things, sent off to some drawer where it would sit forgotten. I have worn it every day since, hidden, because I did not think I had the right to wear it openly. It was not mine to claim, not truly. I only wanted some part of her close to me, and this was the only thing I could take without asking anyone's permission. Alistair reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand, gently, the first time he had done so since the wedding itself, when the taking of hands had been a matter of ceremony rather than choice. You have every right to wear it, he said, openly, if you wish. There is no shame in carrying your sister with you, Serafina. I would rather you wore it plainly than hid it away, as though love were something to be ashamed of. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away this time, and after a moment she nodded, and slowly, with hands that trembled only slightly, she lifted the chain over her head and slipped the ring instead onto the smallest finger of her right hand, where it caught the candlelight, and seemed, for just a moment, to belong there entirely. It was 2 days later that the letter arrived from Lord Ashworth, requesting that his daughter and her husband attend a small gathering at Ashworth Hall the following week, an occasion he described only as a matter of family business, too delicate to explain by post. Serafina read the letter twice, her expression unreadable, and then passed it to Alistair without a word. You know what this concerns, he said, watching her face. I believe so, she said quietly. I believe it concerns the room in the East Wing, and the promise my father asked of me before the wedding. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that it might simply be forgotten, or that he might attend to it himself and spare me the burden of it. It seems he does not intend to. Will you tell me what it is? Alistair asked, before we go, so that I am not walking blind into whatever awaits us. Serafina was quiet for a long moment, turning the ring on her finger, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low and careful, the voice of someone approaching a subject that still frightened her even after everything she had already confessed. Before Rosalind died, she said, she had begun corresponding with someone, a young man, not of great fortune, whom our father would never have approved as a match for a daughter meant to marry a duke, but whom she cared for a great deal. In the quiet, private way one cares for a person they are not permitted to love openly. She kept his letters hidden in a chest in her room, and when she died, our father discovered them, and rather than let the scandal of it touch our family's name, at a time when the marriage arrangement with your house still hung in the balance, he had the room sealed and told no one, not even the young man himself, what had become of the letters or of her feelings toward him. Alistair felt a slow, uneasy weight settle over him. And the young man does not know she is gone. I do not believe he does, Serafina said. Not truly, not the way he ought to know. He was told only that the family had gone into mourning for a distant relation, and that all correspondence must cease, by order of my father, who feared what a grieving suitor might say or do that could unravel the marriage he needed so badly to secure. I have carried the knowledge of this for months, Alistair, that somewhere out there is a man who loved my sister and does not know she is dead, who perhaps believes she simply stopped caring for him, or was forbidden to write by a family too proud to permit the match. It has weighed on me more than almost anything else, and I do not know what my father intends to do about it now, only that he has finally decided the matter cannot wait any longer. Then we will go, Alistair said firmly, and we will learn together what he intends, and whatever is right to be done for that young man, we will see it done, regardless of what it costs your father's pride. Serafina looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something close to relief, close to gratitude, close, perhaps, to the very beginning of trust fully given, rather than cautiously offered. Thank you, she said softly. I did not expect, when I married you, that I would ever have a partner in this. I thought I would carry it all alone, the way I have carried everything since the day she died. You will not carry it alone any longer, Alistair said. Whatever this room holds, Whatever truth your father has kept locked away, we will face it together, and when we return, I think it is time the sealed room at Ashworth Hall was finally opened, and the truth, whatever it costs, was finally allowed to breathe. They rode to Ashworth Hall a week later, beneath a sky the color of pale ash, and Seraphina held herself very straight in the carriage, her gloved hands folded in her lap, the ring she now wore openly catching what little light broke through the clouds. Alistair sat beside her rather than across from her, close enough that their shoulders touched with every turn of the wheels, and he said little on the journey, understanding that she needed the quiet more than she needed conversation. Lord Ashworth received them in the same study as before, but this time he did not sit behind his desk. He stood near the window, his back half turned to them, and when he spoke, his voice had lost the careful, controlled warmth Alistair remembered from his previous visit. It sounded, instead, like the voice of a man who had been waiting a long time to say something he dreaded saying. "I have put this off longer than I should have," Lord Ashworth said, without turning around. "I told myself, after the wedding, that the matter could wait, that there would be a better time to attend to it. I have come to understand there is no better time. There is only the time one finally finds the courage to act, and I fear I have very little courage left in me these days." "Father," Seraphina said quietly, "you need not explain yourself further. I have already told Alistair what I know. We have come because we believe the room should be opened, and the truth allowed its proper place." Lord Ashworth turned then, and Alistair saw that his eyes were wet, though he made no effort to hide it, as though the pretense of composure had finally cost him more than he could continue to pay. "I sealed that room out of fear," he said. "Fear that if the truth of Rosalind's attachment became known, it would reflect poorly on this family, at the very moment we could least afford it. I told myself I was protecting all of us. I have come to understand, these past weeks, that I was protecting no one. I was only hiding my own shame at what I asked of you both, of Rosalind, to give up a love I judged unsuitable, and of you, Seraphina, to step into a life that was never meant to be yours, in silence, without even the comfort of being allowed to grieve properly." He led them then down a narrow passage at the rear of the house, one Alistair had not noticed on his previous visit, to a door with a lock that had clearly not been turned in some months, the key stiff and reluctant in Lord Ashworth's trembling hand. When at last the door swung open, the room beyond was small and plain, unremarkable in every way except for the layer of dust that had settled over everything within it, and the small wooden chest that sat at the foot of the narrow bed, exactly where it had been left the day Rosalind died. Seraphina crossed the room slowly, as though walking into a memory rather than a physical space, and knelt before the chest, lifting its lid with careful hands. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon, and beneath them, a small collection of pressed flowers, a sketchbook filled with drawings of the garden Alistair now recognized from the painting in the sitting room, and a single unfinished letter, written in Rosalind's own hand, clearly meant to be sent but never completed. "May I?" Alistair asked softly, and Seraphina nodded, handing him the unfinished letter rather than the bundle tied with ribbon, which she kept for herself. The letter was addressed to no one by name, only to "my dearest friend," and it spoke, in a voice full of warmth and quiet hope, of a future Rosalind had clearly believed was still possible, even as the arrangement with the Whitmore family loomed over her, a future in which she imagined finding some way, however unlikely, to choose for herself, rather than be chosen for. The letter broke off mid-sentence, unfinished, the way a life breaks off mid-sentence when illness comes too suddenly and too fast for anyone to prepare. "Who was he?" Alistair asked gently. The one she wrote to, Lord Ashworth, who had remained in the doorway, unable or unwilling to step fully into the room, answered before Seraphina could. "His name is Edmund Carow," he said, "the son of the parish steward, a good young man, though of no fortune to speak of. I forbade the match the moment I learned of it, and when Rosalind died, I forbade all mention of it as well, out of fear that any scandal touching her memory might unravel the arrangement your family and mine had made. I have not spoken to him since. I do not know, in truth, whether he has ever been told plainly that she is gone, or whether he still waits, somewhere, for a letter that will never come." Seraphina's hands tightened around the bundle of letters in her lap. "Then he deserves to know," she said, her voice steady now, In a way it had not been steady in weeks. Whatever the cost, to this family's pride, Father, he deserves the truth, and he deserves to grieve her properly, the way I was never permitted to. I do not disagree, Lord Ashworth said quietly. I have thought of little else these past months. I did not know how to begin making it right, and so I did nothing, which I understand now, was its own kind of cruelty, compounding the first. Alistair, watching the two of them, felt something settle firmly in his own chest, a resolve he had not expected to feel so strongly when he had ridden out that morning simply to support his wife through whatever the day required. Then let us begin making it right today, he said. Tell us where to find this young man, and we will go to him ourselves, if you are not able to face it. Serafina has carried this secret long enough. It is time it was set down, for everyone's sake, including his. Lord Ashworth looked at his daughter for a long moment, and something passed between them that Alistair could not fully name. Some old grief finally being acknowledged after months of silence. He lives still in the parish cottage near the old mill, he said at last. I have not seen him myself in nearly a year, though I am told he still asks, from time to time, whether any word has come from this house. I did not have the courage to be the one to answer him. Perhaps it is right that it should not be me. Serafina rose from her knees, the bundle of letters held carefully against her chest, and looked at Alistair with an expression that held, for the first time since he had known her, something that was not quite sorrow, but the steady, quiet strength of a woman who had finally decided to stop hiding from her own grief and use it, instead, to do right by the people it touched. Then let us go to him, she said. Today, if we can manage it, he has waited long enough. The cottage near the old mill was small and neatly kept, its garden trimmed with obvious care despite the modest means of whoever tended it. And Alistair thought, as their carriage drew to a stop along the narrow lane, that there was something quietly touching in the sight of it. A home kept beautiful, perhaps, by a man who still hoped someone might one day come to see it properly. Edmund Caro answered the door himself, a young man of perhaps 26, with an open, honest face that had clearly once been given easily to smiling, though Alistair could see, even in the first moment of greeting, the particular kind of weariness that comes from waiting too long for news that never arrives. He looked between his two visitors with polite confusion, clearly unaccustomed to receiving a duke and duchess at his door, and invited them in with the careful formality of a man who did not quite trust that this visit boded well. They sat in his small front room, where a single shelf held more books than the modest cottage seemed built to accommodate, and Serafina, after a long moment of gathering herself, set the bundle of letters gently on the table between them. Mr. Caro, she said, her voice steady, though her eyes had already begun to fill. I have come to tell you something my family should have told you many months ago, and I am sorry, more than I can say, that it has taken this long. Edmund's gaze moved to the letters on the table, and something in his face changed, even before she spoke again, the particular stillness of a man who senses, in the space of a heartbeat, that the news he is about to receive is not the news he has spent months hoping for. My sister Rosalind passed away last winter, Serafina said. She fell ill quite suddenly, and there was nothing the physicians could do. I am so very sorry that you were not told properly, at the time. My father feared, I believe, what such news might mean for the arrangements our family was making, and in his fear, he made a decision that was not his to make on your behalf, or on hers. The silence that followed was long and heavy, and Alistair watched Edmund's hands, resting on his knees, curl slowly into fists, not out of anger it seemed, but out of the sheer effort of holding himself together in front of strangers, who had, however kindly, just ended a hope he had apparently been nursing in private for the better part of a year. I wrote to her, Edmund said at last, his voice rough. After the letters stopped coming, I wrote 3 more times, thinking perhaps her father had simply forbidden her from replying, which I understood, though it grieved me. I told myself she would find a way to send word eventually, once matters had settled, once the arrangement with the Whitmore family was concluded, and there was less at stake in her being seen to care for someone like me. I have been waiting, my lady. All this time, I have been waiting for a letter I now understand was never going to come, because she was already gone before I wrote the first of those 3 letters. I am so sorry, Serafina said again. And this time her voice broke entirely, the tears she had held back through the telling, finally spilling free. "I found these among her things. I do not know all of what passed between you, but I believed, and I still believe, that they belong to you now, not locked away in a sealed room where no one would ever read them again." Edmund reached for the bundle with hands that trembled visibly, and he untied the faded ribbon with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred. He read the topmost letter in silence, his lips moving faintly over words only he and Rosalind had ever been meant to see. And when he looked up again, his eyes were wet, but there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not only grief, but a kind of relief. The relief of a man who has finally been given the truth after months of uncertain waiting, however painful that truth turned out to be. "Thank you," he said quietly, to both of them. "I do not know how to properly thank you for this. I had begun to fear, these past months, that perhaps she had simply stopped caring, that I had misjudged the whole of it, and that fear was, in its own way, almost worse than grief would have been. Now, at least, I know the truth. She did not stop caring. She was only taken from us both too soon, and no one had the courage to tell me so until today." Alistair, who had said little through the exchange, understanding that this was a conversation that belonged chiefly to Serafina and the young man before them, spoke now for the first time. "If it would bring you any comfort, Mr. Caro, I would be glad to see that her grave receives proper tending, and that you are welcome to visit it whenever you wish. It seems to me that a man who was loved by someone ought to have the right to grieve her properly, in the open, without needing anyone's permission." Edmund looked at him with an expression of quiet, startled gratitude. "That would mean a great deal to me, Your Grace," he said. "I did not know, until you said it, how much I needed someone to simply say that my grief was allowed." They stayed a while longer, speaking gently of Rosalind, of the garden she had loved, of the sketches in her book that Serafina promised to have copied and sent to him, so that some part of what she had left behind might belong properly to the man who had loved her, rather than remaining locked away in a room no one had been meant to enter. When at last they rose to leave, Edmund walked them to the door, and as they stepped out into the cool afternoon air, he said one final thing that stayed with Alistair long after they had driven away. "You are fortunate, my lady," Edmund said to Serafina, "to have a husband who came with you today, to help carry this. Grief carried alone grows heavier with every year. Grief shared, even a little, becomes something a person can bear." Serafina glanced at Alistair as they climbed into the carriage, and for the first time since he had known her, something at the very corner of her mouth lifted, not quite a smile, not yet, but the faint, unmistakable beginning of one, the first sign, however small, that the long winter she had carried since her sister's death might, at last, be beginning to thaw. The weeks that followed brought a quiet, steady change to Ashcombe Manor, the kind that no single event could account for, but that showed itself instead in 100 small ways, noticed most keenly by those who had watched the household longest. Mrs. Fenwick remarked to Winifred one morning that the young Duchess had begun humming to herself while she arranged flowers in the front hall, a small thing perhaps, but one neither of them could recall her doing before. Winifred, for her part, noticed that the crying through the walls at night had grown rarer, and when it came now, it no longer had the same hollow, hidden quality it once had, but sounded instead like the ordinary grief of someone who was, at last, allowing herself to feel it properly, rather than smothering it in silence. Alistair had arranged, as he promised, for Rosalind's grave to be properly tended, and on a mild afternoon, some weeks after their visit to Edmund Caro, he and Serafina rode together to the small churchyard where she was buried, a modest stone marking the plot, half hidden until recently beneath overgrown grass that no one had thought, in the chaos and haste surrounding the wedding, to clear away. The grass had been cut back now, and fresh flowers, the same variety Rosalind had once grown in her own garden, had been planted along the edges of the plot. Serafina knelt before the headstone in silence for a long while, and Alistair stood a respectful distance away, allowing her the privacy of her grief, until she looked up and beckoned him closer, patting the ground beside her. "I used to come here alone," she said, as he knelt beside her, "in secret, before the wedding, and once or twice since, though I told no one where I had gone. I did not think anyone would understand why a bride so recently married needed to visit a grave rather than tend to her new household. I am glad now that I do not have to hide it any longer." "You never have to hide any part of your grief from me," Alistair said. "Not this, and not anything else you have carried alone." She reached for his hand, and he took it, and they sat together in the quiet churchyard, as the afternoon light softened around them, and for the first time, Alistair understood something he had not fully grasped before, that healing did not arrive all at once, in a single grand moment, but gathered slowly, the way morning light gathers in a room, unnoticed, until suddenly the whole space is bright. It was on the ride home that Serafina spoke of something that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "My father asked me, before I left this morning, whether I might consider inviting him to Ashcombe for a visit," she said. "I have not decided how to answer him. Things between us have been strained since the wedding, and more so since we opened the room at his house. I do not know that I am ready to forgive him fully for what he asked of me, though I understand better now why he did it." "You are not obligated to forgive him on any timeline but your own," Alistair said carefully. "But if it would help to have him here, where the memories are perhaps less heavy than in his own house, I would welcome him gladly. Family, even complicated family, deserves the chance to mend, if all parties are willing to try." Serafina considered this in silence for a while, watching the countryside pass beyond the carriage window. "I think," she said finally, "that I would like that. Not yet, perhaps, but soon. I think it is time we stopped letting fear decide what our family is permitted to say to one another." Lord Ashworth came to Ashcombe a fortnight later, arriving with none of the careful, guarded formality Alistair had witnessed on his previous visits to Ashworth Hall. He seemed, if anything, a man relieved of a burden he had carried so long he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. He and Serafina spoke for hours in the small sitting room, beneath the painting of the two laughing sisters, and though Alistair did not intrude on their conversation, he saw, when father and daughter finally emerged, that both of them had been crying, and that neither seemed ashamed of it. "He asked my forgiveness properly this time," Serafina told Alistair later that evening, as they sat together by the fire that had become, in recent weeks, a nightly habit neither of them wished to give up, not as an excuse for what he did, but as an honest accounting of it. He said he understood now that protecting the family's name had cost him something far more valuable, which was his daughter's chance to grieve properly, and his own chance to grieve alongside her, rather than hiding from it in his study, alone, the way I hid in my room, alone, the way we both hid from each other when we needed each other most. "And, do you forgive him?" Alistair asked gently. "I am beginning to," Serafina said. "I think forgiveness, like grief, does not arrive all at once. But I no longer feel the anger I felt when we first opened that room. I feel, instead, something closer to understanding, and I think that is its own kind of progress." Alistair reached for her hand, as had become their habit in quiet evenings such as this one, and found that she no longer flinched at the touch, no longer held herself at the careful distance of a woman waiting to be told she could leave. Something had shifted between them these past weeks, something neither of them could have named on their wedding day, when they had stood before a church full of guests who wished them joy neither of them believed they would ever truly find. "I did not think, when we married," Serafina said softly, watching the fire, "that I would ever come to feel at home in this house, or safe with the man I had been given to. I am glad to find I was wrong." "I did not think, when we married," Alistair said, "that I would come to care so deeply for the woman I had been given as a wife. I am glad to find I was wrong as well." She turned to look at him then, and in the warm light of the fire, something in her face lifted, small and fragile but unmistakably real, the corners of her mouth curving upward in a way that was not quite a full smile, not yet, but close enough that Alistair felt his own chest tighten with something he had not expected to feel this soon, in a marriage built, at first, on nothing more than necessity and debt. There was still healing left to do, he understood. There would be difficult days ahead, moments when grief resurfaced unexpectedly, memories that would catch Serafina off guard in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. But the silence that had once filled this house, the silence of two strangers passing each other in careful, polite distance, had begun, at last, to give way to something warmer, something built not on necessity, but on the slow, patient work of two people, finally choosing to see one another clearly. The invitation came from Lady Pembroke, a distant cousin of Alistair's mother, who hosted a autumn gathering each year that half the county attended out of habit more than genuine enthusiasm. Alistair had thought, at first, to decline on Seraphina's behalf, uncertain whether she was ready to face a room full of curious guests so soon after everything that had passed between them. But Seraphina herself insisted they attend. "I cannot hide from society forever," she said, as her maid fastened the last buttons of a deep blue gown that suited her far better than the pale, careful colors she had worn through the early weeks of their marriage. "And I think, perhaps, it is time I stopped behaving as though my grief were something to be ashamed of in front of others, even if I cannot yet speak of it openly to strangers." Alistair admired her courage even as he worried, privately, what such an evening might cost her. He had come to understand, these past weeks, how much effort it took her simply to hold herself steady in company, how every polite inquiry about her happiness as a new bride landed like a small blow she had learned to absorb without visible flinching. Tonight, surrounded by guests who knew nothing of Rosalind, nothing of the sealed room at Ashworth Hall, nothing of the 11 days of silent weeping that had marked the start of their marriage, she would be expected to simply be happy, or at least to appear so, and Alistair was not certain the appearance would come easily. The evening began well enough. Seraphina moved through the receiving line with practiced grace, and if her smile was thinner than the smiles of the other young brides in attendance, no one seemed to remark on it, at least not within Alistair's hearing. It was during the dancing, some hours later, that the trouble came, and it came from a source Alistair had not anticipated. Lady Pembroke herself, well-meaning, but famously indiscreet, approached them during a lull in the music with the particular bright, prying curiosity of a hostess, determined to draw out gossip for her own amusement. "My dear Duchess," she said, taking Seraphina's hands warmly, "you must forgive an old woman's curiosity, but I have heard the strangest thing from my housekeeper, who has it from a cousin in service near Ashworth Hall, that your family kept the whole household in deep mourning, some months before your wedding. Surely that cannot be true. One does not typically marry so soon after a loss." The music continued around them, and several nearby guests, drawn by the particular quality of attention Lady Pembroke commanded, had begun to listen without quite pretending not to. Alistair felt Seraphina's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on his arm, and he watched, with something close to alarm, the careful mask she had worn so effortlessly all evening begin to strain at its edges. "There was a loss in my family before the wedding," Seraphina said, her voice admirably steady, though Alistair could hear the effort it cost her. "I would rather not discuss the particulars this evening, if you will forgive me." But Lady Pembroke, oblivious to the discomfort she was causing, pressed further. Of course. Though it does explain a great deal, if I may say so. I remarked to my husband only last week that the new Duchess of Ashcombe never seems to smile, not at her own wedding, not at any gathering since, and I confess I had begun to wonder whether the match itself had disappointed her in some way. It is such a relief to learn there is a simpler explanation. The words landed in the small circle of listening guests like a stone dropped into still water, and Alistair saw Seraphina's composure falter, saw the color drain briefly from her face, saw her draw a breath that trembled slightly on its way in. Months of careful hiding, of forcing herself to appear composed at every meal, every visit, every polite inquiry, had not prepared her for having her private grief discussed so casually, so publicly, as though it were merely an amusing piece of gossip to be traded over punch and dancing. Alistair stepped forward before she was forced to answer. "My wife's grief is her own to share, or not to share, as she chooses," he said, his voice carrying enough authority that the small circle of listeners fell quiet at once. "I would ask that no one here presume to discuss it further on her behalf, tonight or at any other time. She has borne a great sorrow, with more grace than most people could manage, and she deserves the courtesy of privacy while she continues to heal from it, not idle speculation, dressed up as concern." Lady Pembroke, to her credit, had the good sense to look genuinely abashed. "Forgive me, Your Grace, she said, addressing them both hurriedly. "I did not mean to cause distress. I spoke without thinking, as I so often do, and I am truly sorry for it." The moment passed, the music resumed its ordinary rhythm, and the small circle of listeners dispersed with the particular haste of people who realize they have witnessed something they were not meant to see. But Serafina remained still for a long moment, her hand still resting on Alistair's arm, and when he looked at her, he saw that her eyes had filled, though she was fighting, visibly, to keep the tears from falling in front of so many watching faces. "Would you like to leave?" he asked quietly. "Not yet," she said, drawing a slow breath. "Give me a moment only." They stepped together onto the terrace beyond the ballroom doors, where the cool night air met them like a kindness, and Serafina finally let the tears fall, quietly, her back to the lit windows so that no one within could see. Alistair stood close beside her, saying nothing, simply present, the way he had learned, these past weeks, that presence itself was often the greatest comfort he had to offer. "I am so tired," she said at last, "of being spoken of as though my grief were a curiosity for other people's entertainment. I thought I had grown stronger these past weeks. Tonight I find I am still as fragile as I was the day we married." "You are not fragile," Alistair said firmly. "You have carried more than most people will ever be asked to carry, and you have done it with a steadiness I admire more than I know how to say. Tonight only proved that healing is not a straight path. It has turns in it, and setbacks, and moments like this one, when an unkind word from a careless woman can undo weeks of careful progress in the space of a single sentence. That does not mean the progress was false. It only means grief takes its own time, and you are allowed to still be healing, even after everything you have already survived." Serafina wiped her eyes carefully, mindful of her paint, and looked up at him with an expression that held, alongside the lingering hurt of the evening, something steadier and more grateful than he had seen from her before. "Thank you for what you said in there," she said. "No one has ever defended me so plainly before, not even my own father, in all these months." "I intend to keep doing it," Alistair said, "for as long as you will have me." She managed, then, something closer to a real smile than he had yet seen from her, small, and still touched by the evening's distress, but genuine nonetheless, and when they returned to the ballroom a short while later, arm in arm, several guests noted, with the particular attentiveness such gatherings encourage, that the young Duchess of Ashcombe, though quiet, no longer looked quite so much like a woman standing apart from her own life, but rather like a woman who had, at last, begun to find her footing within it. Winter came fully to Ashcombe not long after, dusting the gardens with frost, and drawing the household indoors for long, quiet evenings by the fire. It was nearly the anniversary of Rosalind's death, a date Serafina had marked privately in her own mind for months, dreading its approach the way one dreads any anniversary of a loss too large to ever fully set down. "I have been thinking," she said to Alistair one evening, as they sat together in the small sitting room beneath the painting of the two laughing sisters, "that I would like to do something different this year, when the day comes. Something that honors her properly, rather than simply enduring it alone, as I have always done before." "Tell me what you have in mind," Alistair said, "and we will make it happen, whatever it requires." What Serafina proposed, in the days that followed, was a small gathering at the churchyard where Rosalind was buried, not a somber, private visit such as she had made alone in the past, but a proper remembrance, attended by those who had loved her. She wrote to her father, who agreed at once, and she wrote also to Edmund Caro, who replied within days that he would be honored to attend, that he had, in fact, been hoping for some occasion such as this, ever since the truth had finally been given to him. On the appointed morning, a small party gathered at the churchyard beneath a pale winter sky. Alistair and Serafina, Lord Ashworth, Edmund Caro, and even Mrs. Fenwick, who had asked, with unusual hesitance, whether she might be permitted to attend, having grown fond of the young Duchess these past months, and wishing to pay her own quiet respects to a young woman she had never met, but had come to feel, in some small way, that she understood. They stood together around the grave, now properly tended, the flowers Rosalind had once grown herself planted carefully along its edges, and one by one, each of them spoke a small remembrance. Lord Ashworth spoke of his daughter's laughter, and how it had once filled every room of Ashworth Hall, and how he regretted, more than he could say, the months he had spent trying to silence the grief that laughter's absence had left behind, rather than sharing it openly with the daughter who remained. Edmund spoke of her kindness, and her boldness, and the quiet courage it had taken her to care for a man of no fortune despite what her family expected of her. Serafina spoke last, her voice steady in a way it had not been steady even a few short months before. "I used to think," she said, "that carrying my grief alone was a kind of strength, that showing it to others would only burden them, or make me appear weak in a world that expected me to be composed no matter what I had lost. I understand now that grief shared does not diminish the person who shares it. It only allows those who love us to help carry what was always too heavy to carry alone. I wish I had learned that sooner, Rosalind. I wish I had let myself lean on someone, the way you always let me lean on you. But I have learned it now, and I do not intend to forget it again. She knelt and laid a small bundle of flowers at the base of the headstone, and when she rose, Alistair saw that her eyes were wet, as they so often still were on difficult days, but that her face held none of the hollow, hidden sorrow he remembered from the earliest weeks of their marriage. What remained, instead, was something gentler, sadness that had finally been allowed to breathe, grief that no longer needed to hide itself away behind locked doors and careful silence. They returned to Ashcombe that afternoon, and that evening, as the household settled into its familiar quiet rhythms, Alistair found Seraphina in the small sitting room, standing before the painting of the two laughing sisters, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. "I have decided," she said, without turning, "that I should like to have this painting moved to the main gallery, where the family portraits hang. I think it is time Rosalind had a proper place in this house, rather than being kept hidden away where only I ever see her." "I think that is a fine idea," Alistair said, coming to stand beside her. She turned to him then, and in the warm firelight of the sitting room, something in her face opened fully, at last, into something Alistair had waited months to see. A real smile, unguarded and complete, reaching all the way to her eyes, in a way that transformed her whole face into something he had not fully understood, until that moment, how beautiful it could be, when it was not weighed down by grief carried in silence. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not letting me weep alone. I do not think I could have found my way back to this, to smiling like this again, if you had not finally chosen to ask why I never did. I regret that it took me as long as it did," Alistair said, taking her hands in his. "But I do not intend to make that mistake again, not with you, not for as long as we have together." Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall softly over the gardens of Ashcombe Manor, dusting the frozen ground in white, and inside, in the small sitting room, where a painting of two laughing sisters would soon find its proper place among the family it had always belonged to, the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe stood together in the firelight, no longer two strangers bound by necessity and debt, but two people who had, through patience and honesty, and the slow, hard work of finally choosing to see one another clearly, found something neither of them had expected to find in a marriage that began in silence and sorrow. They had found, at last, a home, built not on duty alone, but on the quiet, steady comfort of no longer having to carry their heaviest griefs alone. And in the months and years that followed, those who knew the young Duchess of Ashcombe would remark, quietly and with genuine warmth, that she had become known throughout the county, not for the sadness that had once seemed to follow her everywhere, but for a smile that, once it finally arrived, never again fully left her face.